The vendor principal is your vendor software factory. It will capture your vendor requirements and put these to the marketplace of vendors to build you your own vendor. Let's take a look at an actual vendor called Clear Byte Sequence. This vendor will design the code to reset a string so that it is empty. If you haven't already had some exposure to the Valley, I would recommend drilling down to find the Clear Byte Sequence vendor. You'll need to select the layer, data, the verb, clear, the title, byte sequence, the variation, default, and then the suite x64. Then you'll see the DOFs listed along with all developers in the marketplace who have currently built vendors that provide this design contribution. Conceptually, this vendor looks like so. It needs access to a flow committee for it to organize its own work, and access to a byte sequence committee so that it can have a say over how the string it's going to design the code to clear is designed. Now, we don't know what supply chains this vendor will become a part of in future, and it can have many contracts in flight and belong to many supply chains simultaneously. It could be a part of a supply chain that builds a Bitcoin wallet, and it could have another contract in flight where it is part of a supply chain that builds a missile guidance system. The point is, we don't know and we don't need to. We can simply rest assured that whenever a client vendor contracts this vendor, it will make sure we're in the right committees with the right peers so that we can design that byte sequence. And we'll never know exactly who those peers are either, and we don't need to. But to satisfy your curiosity, here are some examples of possible peers, and here are some more. So let's say in one particular supply chain instance, so a particular contract, this Clear Byte Sequence vendor is put in a committee with the core Linux read and the compare byte sequence. We will all be in touch on that byte sequence committee. If you are building this Clear Byte Sequence vendor, I would recommend visiting the Valley standards to see what outcomes are currently applicable to the DOF committees. For example, if we looked at VTS01 2.1.2.1, we would see that the byte sequence committee currently has 2 valid outcomes, which means the participants on the byte sequence committee can decide to design that byte sequence one of 2 ways, either with its length encoded at the front of the string of bytes, or with the string of bytes terminated with a null character. If we decide to design the string with its length encoded, we would have access to and be responsible for organizing the resulting term committees. There are 2 in the length encoded case, and 1 in the null terminated case. We have to at least cater for the catch-all outcome of length encoded, so we're going to take a look at the vendor's design for that one in more depth now. So we know all these guys will be in a byte sequence committee somewhere in the supply chain, and if we all decide to design the byte sequence with its length encoded, we'll each be responsible for organizing the resulting term committees of length, committee type integer, and bytes, committee type bytes. So how do we actually build a vendor that does all of these things? Request access to committees, join committees, make decisions, contract other vendors, and organize their DOF committees. We're going to take a look right now. And I would recommend temporarily adding the Clear Byte sequence to your portfolio so that you can step through the expression as we talk about it now. So we've just imported the vendor into our portfolio and started a new expression. This is all the client of our vendor sees, the requested access to committees. In your vendor principal, we can see the suite that we're designing for, the only thing our client sees, up in the top left corner here. Now let's take a look under the hood at what our clients can't see. This is our vendor software factory. It's capturing our vendor requirements, who it will contract, what decisions it will make, and how it will organize committees. The vendor principal has decided the best way to capture these requirements is to make it look like we're actually contracting and actually joining committees. There could be a completely different vendor principal that captures requirements in a completely different way. This is the only iteration that exists at present. So here's the other end of those committees we're requesting access to. They've got nobody connected to them yet, but they're there, ready to go. Now we're going to automate our vendor to join the byte sequence committee by selecting self from the drop-down box of reps in the byte sequence committee. There, the vendor principal is giving us a representation of the term committees for us to organize, one for the length and one for the bytes. Now let's automate the contracting of a supplier. We're designing the code to clear a byte sequence with its length encoded at the front of the bytes. So what we need to do is make sure that length is reset to 0, effectively clearing the byte sequence. So we're going to contract a set integer and get him to design the code to set that length to 0. To do that, you'll need to add a new supplier and drill down. This supplier is requesting access to two committees, one for the flow, which is basically him requesting access to a construction site, and one for the integers, so that he is in touch with all those who are going to design that integer. First, we can organize the set integer flow DOF inside the clear flow committee our own client will give us access to, like so. Then we can organize the integer DOF inside the length integer term committee, and we can just leave the bytes committee empty on our end because we won't actually be adding anyone else to it on our side. Now we've threaded together the communications side of things, but we still haven't satisfied the automation requirements of our vendor. To design us our vendor, the vendor principal needs to know when all of the actions we just listed in the communications window will actually occur, and what events will trigger them. To satisfy these requirements, we need to jump over to the processing window of the vendor principal. Here, the vendor principal is telling us that based on the actions we want to take over in the communications window, we have two events that could occur as our own vendor operates. One that will always occur is the contract accepted source event. Anything we trigger to occur of this event will occur as soon as our own vendor accepts a new contract. We also have access to another event for triggering when the outcome of that byte sequence we joined is length encoded. Because we're automating the vendor to join the byte sequence committee, we also have access to the specs, the maximum length of that byte sequence. The last set of nouns that we have access to are syncs. These are associated with us contracting the set integer supplier. He needs to know what value to set the integer with, and the vendor principal itself needs to know when we want to contract this guy. So let's express our automation requirements. We'll need to have our vendor define a new constant, 0. So just add a new process, select define, and give 0 as the bytes. We can then organize the constant requested by the set integer supplier underneath that byte's value. Next, we can organize when we want the vendor's stance of length encoded to trigger. Since we're only automating for the length encoded outcome, we always want our vendor to specify that stance, so we'll organize its trigger up under the contract accepted event. And we can organize the defining of that constant 0 here as well. And lastly, we can trigger the contracting of that set integer supplier only when the outcome of the byte sequence is length encoded, by organizing it under the length encoded event like so. Our expression is now complete, and we can build. The vendor built from this expression will be automated to provide a clear byte sequence design contribution every time it gets a contract. And since our vendor is paying its subby 100 Satoshi every time it's contracted, we can set our own vendor's contract price to be, say, 130 Satoshi. That's a tidy little 30 Satoshi per contract.